So Shana Tova, everybody. Good to share a second day with all of you. People think about the blockbuster films of the summer that featured a strong female protagonist. And Barbie is probably the first one to come to mind for most of you, I'll admit it. But much to the dismay of those who are hoping for a Barbie-themed sermon this morning, it's not happening. Another time, a different rabbi, maybe. This is not a sermon about Barbie, I'm sorry to disappoint. It is instead a sermon about a much more important film, at least to my mind, that also featured a strong female protagonist. It wasn't Barbie, it was the film Golda. Has anyone here seen Golda? It didn't do as well as it should. It really didn't. I wish more would have watched this film because it tells a story that we need to remember. It's a story of the turmoil of the Yom Kippur War. It's a story of the pressure that Golda was under almost to the day 50 years ago in 1973 at the start of the Yom Kippur War, when the streets of Israel should have been so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. They should have been empty as they are most years on Yom Kippur. They should have been quiet only with the sounds maybe of hearing the davening from the shuls, that's it. But they weren't. During those days in 1973, they're remembered as a moment of critical, of almost hopeless, desperate struggle for survival. It was just a few decades after the Shoah. Israel was now on the brink of destruction again in the Sinai and the Golan. We were at that time of the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago, a fighting force caught completely unaware, the stillness of our holiest day shattered by the drumbeat of war. It was Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, who was a celebrated general at that time. He's recorded as saying to Prime Minister Golda Meir on that day, the Third Commonwealth could very well be destroyed. The first fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC, the second to the Romans in 70 CE, and now this modern sovereign Jewish state in existence at that time, only a short 25 years, all could be lost for the Jewish people again. We were outnumbered. 2/3 of Israeli soldiers were home where they should be with their families for Yom Kippur. They were far away from their guns, from their planes, from their tanks. Here in the United States, a rabbi of a large conservative congregation in Kansas City, at that moment on Yom Kippur, took his sermon and he threw it in the garbage. You know why? Because instead of preaching the sermon that he was going to preach, he stood right there in synagogue on that day and he said to his people, Israel is under siege, and this is pikuach nefesh. This is about saving the lives of our brothers and sisters who are fighting for our homeland. And he began, instead of preaching that sermon, selling war bonds for Israel. He called out to the congregation right there on Yom Kippur, $35,000. Who's buying for $50,000? Do I have any takers? Can you imagine that moment of existential crisis that would require a rabbi on the holiest day to ask that of a congregation? But that was the feeling 50 years ago, almost to the day. And now 50 years later, here I am, standing before all of you with a similar feeling because our beloved Jewish homeland once more has faced a year of crisis beyond measure. The Israel of 2023 is facing not a crisis of military strategy, not a crisis of territory or foreign forces, though there are always those crises too, but a crisis today of self-definition. Who are we? Who are we? What should be the character of the Jewish state? To be a Jewish democracy is a very complicated proposition. Because which value ranks higher? Do we emphasize the Jewishness of the state? Do we emphasize the democratic process? And when those two are at odds, which they can be, and which they seem to be through this summer, where do we land as a people? Where do we land as Jews committed, I hope, to this land we call our home? It's not an overstatement to say to you today that this year was among the most difficult and complicated and therefore important to talk about on Rosh Hashanah in all of Israel's short history. The streets of Israel in 2023, like they were in 1973, have not been quiet. They've been loud with the noise of hundreds of thousands, more than half the country in the streets through the course of the summer, leading right up to this moment. Still, many have seen the videos. Many have seen the pictures. If you haven't, you can picture the scene in your mind right now. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis marching with flags in Democracy Square in Tel Aviv, with loudspeakers broadcasting the voice of David Ben-Gurion, reading Israel's Declaration of Independence in the streets. These protesters are patriotic. They identify as proud Zionists. They're carrying flags. They're singing Hatikva. They're chanting the words, Ein li eretz acheret, I have no other nation. They make up all ages and demographics. They are religious. They are secular. They are Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Who are they? What are they protesting? What does it have to do with us? Thousands and thousands of miles away, but whose hearts, I hope, are with the land, whose prayers are directed today as they are each and every time we come into the synagogue and face east toward our Holy Land. What's at stake this year for us, American Zionists, which I hope you are? What's at stake for the future of U.S.-Israel relations? First, the facts, as I understand them, sharing them as objectively now as possible. It is a risky sermon, and so I'm not, and you'll never find me picking sides necessarily. I'm here to teach. I'm here to learn. I'm here to care alongside all of you today. But first, the facts as I understand them. Prime Minister Netanyahu has initiated a very major shift in the way that Israeli government operates. He's giving more power to the elected coalition of which he is a part, taking power then from the judges, from the high court, shifting the balance of power, some would say, and stepping over or skirting the checks and balances system that allows instead for his coalition, for his supporters, to operate and make their key decisions with fewer restrictions, shall we say, opening possibilities to himself and to his allies to work in ways that are less fettered by the court. It's a shift that some would contend, and many have, is throwing the democratic balance of the state into serious question. It's making Israel, they might say, more autocratic or more theocratic in nature and less democratic in nature. And so, yeah, you can imagine there would be protests. And yeah, you can imagine there would be outrage and reaction, and it has been seismic. It's a shift that has caused congregants within our community to question their support for Israel, financially or otherwise. People have come into my office through the course of the summer and said things like, Rabbi, I've been writing checks and it's meaningful for me to give to Israel. Through the last 40, 50 years of my life, I've been writing checks to AIPAC, to JNF, to FIDF. And now with all that I see going on, they say to me, can I in good conscience, Rabbi, continue to write those checks? Can I be a Zionist who's in love with the idea of Israel, who's in love with the history of Israel, the culture and the people and the promise of Israel, who feels that Israel is in a deep and real spiritual sense my home, who understands the vital importance of Israel, and yet who deplores or is frightened by or is deeply concerned by this current government. Can I write those checks as an American Jew? It's a shift that's caused many rabbis, even conservative rabbis, to change the way they run the services. I have colleagues in the city who took the prayer for Israel out of their Shabbat service altogether, and then when the pressure came, they put it back. But when they put it back, they took out the part that says we pray for Israel's leaders and ministers. They said, we'll pray for Israel, but God help us if we pray for Bibi Netanyahu. And that's how it stands in congregations outside of this one, many of them. It's a shift that some would say is dangerous because on a very fundamental level, it risks Israel losing American support financially or otherwise. The current administration, if you've been following, you know, has questioned Netanyahu, has questioned and even condemned in terms that are stronger than usual the current coalition. And that's sad. You might even go as far to say, as many have, that this is a change that risks the very biblical, the very Torah values that are at the foundation of our Holy Land. I'll remind you, we have a Torah portion. It's called Shoftim. It's called Judges. It's a portion that talks all about fairness and impartiality and legal decision making. It's a core biblical value that doesn't go back just to the time of the modern state and the vision of Herzl and Ben-Gurion. It goes back to the vision our ancestors had for the promised land thousands and thousands of years ago, that it should be a land that's a beacon of truth, that's a beacon of justice, which is achieved by a multiplicity of voices. The ancient high court, the Sanhedrin, had 71 sages who argued, but who balanced one another out without silencing the voices of each other, without pushing 1 or 2 or 20 or 50 of those members of the Sanhedrin out of the room. So yeah, it has been a complicated year for Israel. Complicated because that's all just one side. And as I look around, some are nodding your heads and some are looking down, because that wasn't your side. And there is another side to this. There's a side, many sitting in this room, who are less concerned, who are supportive of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who say things like, don't blow it out of proportion, don't overreact. Of course Israel is still a democracy. Netanyahu won the majority of votes in a fair election. Love him or hate him, he's the one that Israelis have chosen, and not chosen once, chosen, I remind you, again and again and again. He is the longest serving prime minister in the history of the state. First term, anybody know? 1996. He's been in power. And he has devoted his life, love him or hate him, to serving our people. He is, they would say, on this side, and the ones putting their lives on the line, picking up guns or giving guns to their sons or daughters to defend the land on our behalf, while us and our children sit here and just talk about it? They're the ones who are entitled to the perspective. And your perspective, these people would say, oh, conservative Jews sitting in the pews. While interesting as a thought experiment and interesting in the abstract, is nice, but ultimately shallow. As the rabbi, I have the joy of hearing all the voices. I have the joy of listening to both sides. I have the blessing of getting to see, when I can, the merit in both sides. I hear the fear behind both voices. I hear the concern behind both. I hear the love behind both sides for this place we call our Jewish home. And as complicated as this year has been, as this issue is, it gives me hope that at the very least, so many of you still care. Whichever side you're on, it gives me hope that there are Jews who want to learn about this issue, who care about this issue. Too many modern Jews don't. Too many would say, I don't give a what's going on in Israel. My Jewish life is here and that's it. And that hurts me. I would rather you, in so many cases, have a critical but a thoughtful approach to Israel from a place of love than to say nothing because it's not important to you. We know in any relationship in life, to have a relationship that's all love and all good, it's naive. To have a relationship that's all chastisement and all negativity and all pointing out the faults under a microscope, that's unfair and ugly. My perspective, just like that rabbi who called on his congregation for bonds to be purchased on Yom Kippur 50 years ago, in that moment of real crisis, wherever you land, and even if you've been totally out of the Jewish loop and you had no idea what was going on all summer and you're surprised that I'm even talking about it, I call on you today to support, to care for Eretz Yisrael, not to turn your back on her this year, to continue to learn, to continue to visit, to continue to support, and I'll even go a step further and say to continue to fight for the Israel that you believe in, whichever one that is. To feel that our land is worth believing in and worth fighting for, the way our ancestors did when they stood at the ruins of the destroyed temple in 70 CE and they cried tears of pain, and those tears fell onto the stones. And then in 1967, at that same spot, at the one wall that remained, they cried tears again, but then they were tears of rejoicing, tears of coming home. Can you feel that? Can you know what the psalmist meant when he said, Im eshkachech, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, I'm not fully me as a Jew. Don't forget her. Don't abandon her. The promise of our destiny as a people is wrapped up in the land. It is the birth of everything we do here, across the states, wherever you may be as a Jew, the birthplace of our culture, our heritage, our Torah, our connection to God, all of it. Im eshkachech, if I forget you, Jerusalem, what do I have left? I'm a body without a soul. On a very personal level for me, I'll remind you that it was the love of the land that really is the reason I'm even standing here today. It was time in Israel that made it clear to me that I want to devote my life to all of you, to the Jewish people, people outside the land, and the people in it. I arrived after college in Israel with a law school application. I was ready for a couple months of study, come back here, and be a good Jewish lawyer like everybody wanted. But in 2 months, in 3 months of being there, and feeling the energy of that place, and feeling the way that the stones cry out to our souls as Jews, making me feel connected to my heritage in ways that I had never felt before I knew that this is my life, that this is what I fight for. And it's not an easy task in 2023. Go to any college campus and you'll know what a challenging and precarious task it is. I was there again during rabbinical school. I was there again when Kaylee was there as a rabbinical student. We got engaged in Tel Aviv. She planned our wedding while in Israel. Our engagement photos are there in Tel Aviv. And after that, we had dessert at the world's hippest jazz nightclub. And it was one of the best days of my life. And what strikes me always as I think about those months and those years, as I think about the land, is how it really is, in such a deep and hard way, a land of complication. How very Jewish is that? That you can go from davening in Yerushalayim at 6:30 a.m. at the Wall to being at a jazz club in Tel Aviv by 6:30 at night? It's modern, and it's ancient. It's a land born of trauma, the pain of the Shoah, a people who had nothing that was transformed miraculously, and it's a miracle, into a almost socialist kibbutz agricultural paradise, which then shifted again and morphed into the capitalist technological epicenter that it is today, that gives so much to our world. It's these contradictions that make the land so complicated. It's the contradictions that make the land so tense, so Jewish in that sense. But they are what demonstrates, to me, the land's holiness. Because for all those contradictions and all those tensions that you feel when you're there and you step off the plane and you feel that, still there is no other place, and there never will be, according to this rabbi, where God is most present and where a Jew can truly feel at home. Shimon Peres summed up my feelings this morning. He said, "It's my job to worry about the future history of Israel." I love that. It's my job to worry about the future history of Israel. I myself go into this year deeply conflicted. I'm proud of the protesters because they protested civilly and continue to protest civilly and patriotically. We have a lot to learn from those protesters here in the United States. I, as a conservative Jew, whose wife is a rabbi, you better believe we don't identify with the ultra-Orthodox wing of this coalition that would have Israel be a place perhaps where we would be shunned or screamed at, or worse, for davening together in the way that we like to, celebrating the holidays as we do. And still, reading Prime Minister Netanyahu's book this summer, I really do my best not to vilify, not to consider him to be the horrible demon that some make him out to be, not to judge him too unfairly, not to be like the anti-Zionists who, many of them, and I'm not saying it's those in the room, but many do, hate him without knowing what's going on, hate him without reading, hate him without visiting, hate him without thinking. But to see him as a man with flaws, as all men are, a man who so many Israelis have put their trust in, the trust of their lives, and a man who has lived a life, love him or hate him, of service to the Jewish people in ways that none of us can understand. He is in the most difficult leadership position probably in the entire world. I don't know how he ever sleeps. I worry about the future history of Israel, but I'm proud of a nation as strong as ours to withstand this given its complexity and challenge, still we contribute so much. I will always stand by her side, even when she doesn't live up to what I would hope, because I, like thousands of years of Jews before me, will continue to love, to continue to make my perspective known, to fight for the Israel that I believe in, and to do it with a full heart. Whether this change marks a real beginning of an intense shift in the very makeup, the very democratic nature of the Jewish state, or maybe it's just going to be another political wave swinging right on the pendulum before it comes and swings left again. I don't know. I'm a rabbi, not a prophet. But I will go to my grave defending Israel's right to exist, to determine her own interests and her own needs. Fighting for her, for me, is worth every single complication and every single disappointment and every single heartbreak. And I hope you sitting in this room today have some reason to feel the same. And if you don't, join me for coffee. And we'll talk about it. And we'll learn. And maybe we'll feel closer together, sitting at a Starbucks so very far away, but feeling in our hearts so very close, fighting for and learning about the Israel that we believe in. 50 years ago today, it was Golda Meir, with her incredible charisma and strength, who held us together as a people. And 50 years later, almost to the day, I leave you again, now with her words. Because it was Sukkot, a few days after the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, she decided, Golda, to visit some of the soldiers who were stationed there in the Golan Heights. It was after a bitter battle in which the tanks had finally succeeded in stopping fierce Syrian attacks. And then she came to them and said, Chag Sameach, because it was Sukkot after all. And they turned, these soldiers, and they were surprised. Golda Meir, the prime minister, has come to meet with us. She asked them, does anyone have any questions for me? And one soldier finally worked up the courage to speak up. I have a question, he began. My father, he said, was killed in the War of Independence, but we won. My uncle, he said, was killed in the 1956 war, but we won. My brother was killed in the Six-Day War, but we won. Last week, he said, I lost my good friend here in battle, and I'm sure that in the end, again, we will win. But are all these sacrifices worth it? What is all this worth if we can't just live in peace? Golda Meir was silent. She thought for several moments, and then she turned to the soldier, and she said, I cry and mourn for all of those losses in my bed at night. I think about them. I think about all the soldiers and their families, and I have to tell you something, that this war isn't just any old war. If this war was just about us and for us, it's likely that you'd be right. But if our sacrifices are for the entire Jewish nation, or for the entire Jewish people, then I believe with my full heart, Golda said, that it's worth any price. Our destiny and the destiny of the land and the people in it are one. Too many sacrifices have been made for the sake of this land, for us American Jews to turn our backs on her today, regardless of which government is currently in power and whether you agree or not, because you know what? Politics are messy. Nowhere are they messier than in Israel, that kaleidoscope of competing values, the land of two Jews, three opinions. But I will fight for her, and I will continue to fight for her, and I will applaud her blessings, and I will mourn her failures alongside you. To me, that fight is worth any price. If If I forget you, Yerushalayim, I have nothing. Without you, Israel, I am not fully me. I hope in this coming year, whatever challenges it brings, as the noise of protests continue on right up to this very day, and I'm sure beyond into Sukkot and into the year, that you will know what's going on, that you will care, that you will feel a part of the Jewish story and therefore feel a part of the story of Eretz Yisrael, that you will fight for the Israel you believe in, the Israel that makes you who you are as a Jew, and that you will stand with me by her side. Shana Tova.